the iris you fell in love with gave you ruffled purple falls and a bright bronze beard. 3 or 4 blooms open at once on a single stalk in the late May sun. This year, the same plant stands in a big, healthy fan of green sword leaves, tall and thriving, with not one flower on it. You did nothing wrong. That plant is almost never sick or tired or a bad variety, but a single inch of soil is sitting in the wrong place, and this August is exactly when you lift it and put it right. What that fan is really doing changes how you feel about the whole thing. Those green swords are the plant feeding itself. The leaves catch the light and pour that energy down into the thick stem underneath, the rhizome, the part that looks like a knobby potato lying just under the soil. A big fan means the leaves are working. It means the roots are alive and the plant is holding plenty of stored food. In 30 years of building perennial borders, I have dug up hundreds of these healthy, flowerless clumps, and almost every time the plant underneath was in fine shape. It was not dying. It was doing everything except the one thing you actually wanted, which was throwing up a flower stalk in spring. There is a quiet fact about iris that helps here, and hardly anyone mentions it. A single rhizome flowers once in its life. That fan you are looking at will bloom the once from the growing tip, and after that, the piece of stem never flowers again. What carries the color forward, spring after spring, are the new offsets it pushes out around its shoulders, the daughters, each of which grows its own fan and blooms in its turn. So a clump that keeps blooming is really a clump that keeps making strong new increases. Hold on to that, because it explains why crowding and depth hit the flowers so hard while the leaves sail on regardless, so we can cross a few things off straight away. You did not buy a dud. A named bearded iris is a tough plant, and a clump that has given you healthy fans for years has not quietly turned into a bad variety. The plant is not exhausted and finished either. That kind of broad green foliage is the opposite of a plant giving up. And in most beds, it is not a feeding problem in the way people assume, where the poor thing is starving for want of fertilizer. A starving iris makes thin, pale, floppy leaves. Yours are making wide green ones. What you've got is a plant full of energy with nowhere to spend it. The most common reason a healthy bearded iris stops flowering is rarely a disease at all. It comes down to depth. The rhizome is sitting too deep, sometimes under nothing more than an inch of soil or an inch of mulch, and a rhizome that is buried behaves like a plant somebody switched off. The leaves keep coming because they live up at the surface. Flowers are a different matter. They depend on that thick stem sitting where it belongs, and once it is buried, they simply stop. And August, right in the heat of summer, is the season to lift it and set it back where it wants to be. To fix depth, you have to know where a bearded iris rhizome actually wants to live, and it is higher than almost anyone plants it. The rhizome belongs right at the surface. Its top, the back of that potato-like stem, should sit level with the soil or with only the thinnest skim of earth over it, while the true roots, the stringy white ones, reach down into the ground below to anchor the plant and drink. The old hands have a phrase for it. Plant it like a duck in the water. The body of the duck rides on the surface where you can see it, and the feet paddle down below out of sight. That is your rhizome, and those are your roots. In a bed that is set right, the back of the rhizome shows as a pale ridge along the surface, dry in the open air, with the green fan rising off one end. That ridge is your reference point because every problem we are about to work through is some version of the rhizome ending up lower than that, and every fix is some version of floating it back to where a duck would sit. This is where I part company with a lot of the gardening videos you have watched, because plenty of them give the wrong reason, and a wrong reason leads good gardeners to do strange things. The popular story goes like this. An iris rhizome, they say, needs to sunbathe. The sun has to strike its bare back so it can bake next year's flower buds into the top of the stem, and if you cover it, you rob it of that sunlight and it cannot set buds. Some versions add that the bare rhizome needs the swing between hot days and cool nights to trigger bloom, and that a blanket of soil dulls that swing. It sounds tidy. It sounds like something you would want to be true. But the American Iris Society, the people who have grown and bred these plants for a century, treat that idea as a myth. Their own writers say it plainly. An iris will bloom perfectly well with an inch or more of soil over the rhizome, and nothing magical happens the moment sunlight touches the surface of the stem. The sunbathing story is not the mechanism, so why does keeping them shallow work at all, if not for the sunbathing? Because the real reasons are less romantic and a good deal more convincing. The first one is the simplest. A rhizome is not a bulb. If you plant a tulip bulb 3 or 4 inches down, that is exactly right, and a lot of people pick up an iris and plant it the same way, several inches deep, because it feels like the safe and proper thing to do. Buried that deep, a bearded iris genuinely will not flower, and often it will not survive. The plant has to shove every leaf up through inches of cold soil. It wears itself out doing it, and the stem that should be riding at the surface is stranded down in the dark and the wet instead. Deep planting on its own is enough to end the bloom. The second reason does the quiet damage in an established bed. A rhizome that sits buried in warm, moist summer soil rots. There is a bacterial soft rot that lives in ordinary garden soil, and a fat rhizome pressed down under earth and mulch in July heat is exactly the warm, airless, damp thing that rot is looking for. It works in through a wound or a soft spot, and it hollows the stem into a foul-smelling mush. A rhizome turning to mush cannot push a flower stalk. Sometimes it cannot push anything at all, and you lose that piece of the clump entirely. Keeping the crown up in the open air, dry on top, is how you keep soft rot out. That is the honest reason the bare rhizome rule is right, and it has nothing to do with sunlight feeding the buds and everything to do with a drowning stem going rotten. Carry both halves of that out to the garden with you because it changes what you do. The practical rule the garden centers hand you is right. Keep bearded iris shallow and lift the ones that have sunk. Their reason for it is oversold, though. The sunbathing has no part in it. You keep the crown shallow so it can breathe and stay dry. Same instruction, truer reason, and the truer reason is the one that tells you what to do this month. But that raises a fair question. If you planted the thing correctly, shallow and floating at the surface, and it bloomed beautifully for years, how on earth does it end up buried? You never took a shovel to it. And that is the sneaky part, the thing that catches experienced gardeners who did everything right on planting day. The garden buries it for you, slowly, an inch at a time. Every rain drives a little silt down between the fans and settles it over the crown. The soil in a bed naturally sinks and packs over 3, 4, 5 seasons, so the rhizome that started at the surface is now sitting a finger's width lower than it began. Then spring comes and you do the thing every tidy gardener does. You top the bed with a fresh inch of mulch to keep it neat and hold the moisture, and you do it again the next spring and the one after that. Nobody buried that iris on purpose. The rain, the settling, and 3 years of well-meant mulch did it between them, and one quiet inch at a time they smothered the crown. That is how a plant that gave you a river of purple every May simply stops. It did not get sick, and it did not get old. It got covered. The fan sails on up through the loose mulch, none the wiser, while the flower stem underneath sits buried, warm and damp, and quietly going to rot. Once you can see that clearly, you stop reaching for iris food and replacement plants, and you start reaching for the one thing that actually fixes it, which is your own 2 hands and a spare August afternoon. I learned that the hard way. My own first iris border quit on me inside 3 years, and I blamed the plants, then the soil, then the weather, before I finally lifted a clump and found the rhizomes sitting a good 2 inches down under mulch I had heaped on with my own hands every spring. The fix itself is often gentler than you fear, so let me walk you through exactly what I do. You do not always have to lift and divide the whole clump. Start with the lightest touch and only escalate if the plant asks you to. Before you dig anything, kneel down in front of the clump and part the fans with your fingers, right down to where the leaves meet the ground. You are hunting for the rhizome, that pale, knobby stem. In a healthy, shallow planting, you will see the back of it, a firm ridge sitting at the surface between the fans. Press a fingertip on it while you are there. A good rhizome feels firm, like a raw potato. If it gives under your finger, soft and spongy, the rot has already started and that piece needs dealing with. If you part the leaves and find only bare soil or mulch and no rhizome showing anywhere, that is your answer. It is sunk, or it has been buried and it is too deep to bloom. If burial is all that is wrong, the fix is almost embarrassingly simple. You do not need a fork at all. You scrape the settled soil and pull the mulch back off the top of the rhizome with your fingers or a hand trowel gently until the crown of that stem is sitting in the open air again, dry on top, with the fans rising cleanly off it. That is the whole job. You have unburied it. Do that in August, and you have handed the plant its entire autumn to sit properly, root back in, and recover before the cold. I have brought clumps back into full bloom, doing nothing more than easing a couple of inches of old mulch off a crown that had been slowly drowning underneath it. Sometimes it is more than depth. When you part the fans, you might find the rhizome not only buried but crowded, ringed with so many offsets that the center has gone woody and bare. Or you might find the stem soft and half rotted where the rot has already got a start. That clump wants lifting. Push a garden fork into the soil well outside the clump and lever the whole thing up, roots and all. Use a fork, not a spade, because a fork slides between the roots and lifts, while a spade slices straight through the fleshy rhizome and hands the rot a fresh wound to walk into. Shake the soil off and see what you have got. Firm, fat rhizomes with a healthy fan and white roots are your keepers. Anything soft, brown, hollow, or foul-smelling, cut it away with a clean knife and throw it out, because rot spreads through a clump if you let it. Before you replant a keeper, trim its leaf fan down to a stubby fan about a hand tall, cut straight across or to a shallow point. It looks brutal, but it stops the wind from rocking the plant and loosening the new roots before they can grip, and the plant will not miss a few inches of old leaf. Then you reset the piece. Open a shallow hole, leave a low ridge of firm earth running down the middle of it, sit the rhizome astride that ridge with its back at ground level, and drape the white roots down either side of it like a saddle over a horse before you press them in. Leave the crown showing. Point the growing tip of the fan in the direction you want the clump to travel, because a rhizome creeps forward the way its leaves face. Space the pieces a good hand's width apart, so they have room to build up before they crowd each other again. And there is one step people skip that saves the plant. Water it in once, thoroughly, to settle the soil around those roots and close the air pockets. Then leave it on the dry side. Do not keep watering a freshly reset iris. A newly disturbed rhizome sitting in warm, wet August soil is the exact meal soft rot is waiting for. And the kindest thing you can do after that first drink is to back off and let the top stay dry. From then on, the rule is permanent. Keep mulch pulled back off the crown for good. Never let it creep back over the stem, and keep the bed weeded so nothing shades or smothers it again. There is a reason August, and not some prettier month, is the time to be doing all this. A bearded iris takes its rest in the summer heat, going quiet and half dormant in the weeks after bloom, so lifting it now interrupts almost nothing. But the timing is about more than the plant simply resting. A bearded iris lays down next spring's flower buds inside the rhizome across late summer and autumn, not in spring when you finally see them open. So a crown that is sitting correctly and breathing through these coming weeks is a crown that can actually form those buds, while one still buried and sweating underground can miss the chance to set them at all. Get it up into the air now, and you catch that window. Work through July, August, or on into September, and you leave the plant a clear run of at least 4 to 6 weeks of warm soil before the first hard frost, which is roughly what it needs to push fresh roots and grip the ground before winter. Reset it now, and those new roots hold it firm through the freezing and thawing that heaves a late-planted iris clean out of the soil. Leave it into the cold, and the plant goes into winter, loose and unrooted, which is a gamble you do not need to take. Do all that this August, and you have reset the clock. The plant spends the cool of autumn settling its roots into soil that finally drains and breathes, and it goes into winter well anchored, set to flower the moment spring warms the bed. If you would like more of this kind of plain-spoken help with the plants already in your borders, subscribe and I will keep them coming. Before you take any of this out to the bed, there is one warning that matters more than anything else I've told you, because if you get it wrong, you can set back your other irises. Everything I've said so far, keep the rhizome bare, lift the buried ones, never mulch over the crown, is true for one kind of iris only, and if you apply it to the wrong kind, you will set that plant back instead of helping it. The rule is for bearded iris, the ones with the fat rhizome and the fuzzy caterpillar of a beard crawling down the falls. Those are the plants that want to ride high and dry, like a duck. The beardless irises are the opposite, and plenty of careful gardeners have hurt a healthy plant by treating them the same. A Siberian iris, with its narrow grassy leaves and its smooth falls, wants to be planted deeper, about an inch under the soil, not bare on top. The same goes for a Louisiana iris and a Spuria iris, roughly an inch down. A Japanese iris wants to go deeper still, about 2 inches under, because it does something the bearded types never do. It builds each year's new roots on top of the old ones, climbing slowly upward, so it needs that soil above the crown to root into. Stranger still, those beardless irises actually want the mulch that the bearded ones must never have. A blanket of mulch keeps their roots cool and damp, which is exactly what a Siberian or a Japanese iris likes, sitting as they often do near a pond edge or in a moist border, and exactly what a bearded rhizome would rot under. So before you go stripping soil off any iris crown this August, be sure which one you are looking at. Fat rhizome and a bearded fall. Keep it bare and shallow, and lift it if it has gone under. Grassy leaves and a smooth beardless fall, leave it deeper and let it keep its mulch. Get those two backwards and the fix becomes the injury. Same family, opposite instructions, and the whole difference is the beard. Depth is the headline, and in an established bed that suddenly quit blooming, it is the first thing I check. But an honest answer has to admit that depth is not the only thing that stops a bearded iris from flowering, and while you are down at the bed with your hands in the fans, you should read the other two off the plant in the same walk. The first is sun. A bearded iris needs a lot of it, at least 6 to 8 hours of direct sun a day to bloom well, and it will happily make leaves in far less light than it needs to make flowers. This is the trap in a maturing garden. You planted the iris in a bright open spot years ago, but the shrub behind it has thickened, the tree overhead has spread, and the perennials on either side have grown taller and started leaning over the fans. The iris is standing in part shade it never signed up for. The leaves carry on, because leaves are cheat to the plant, but the flowers thin out. Then stop. When you are at the clump, glance up. If the iris is being shaded out by taller neighbors, no amount of resetting the rhizome will fix it. It has to move into the open, or the neighbors have to be cut back. The one exception is the hottest, brightest climates, where a little shade through the fierce afternoon does no harm and can spare the blooms a scorching. But in most gardens, the fault is too little sun, not too much. The second co-cause is crowding, and it is every bit as common as depth in an old planting. Remember that each rhizome flowers only once, and the bloom rides forward on the fresh offsets. A single bearded rhizome does not stay single. It throws off new offsets around its edge every year, a ring of daughters around the mother, and for a while that is exactly what you want, because it fills in and gives you more bloom. But left alone, the clump keeps multiplying inward on itself until the center becomes a woody, exhausted, leafless knot, with a crowd of hungry young rhizomes fighting over the same few inches of soil and the same food. A clump packed that tight pours its energy into staying alive, not into flowers. That is why bearded iris wants dividing every 3 to 5 years, and it is why lifting a crowded clump this August, splitting off the young, vigorous pieces, each a single healthy fan on a firm length of rhizome, about as long as your thumb, and throwing away the spent woody heart, so often brings the bloom straight back. The third fault you can cause yourself, out of kindness. Too much nitrogen. If you feed a bearded iris a rich, high-nitrogen lawn-type fertilizer, or you pile fresh manure around it, you push exactly the wrong kind of growth. Nitrogen drives soft, lush leaves, which is the last thing a plant already drowning in foliage and short on flowers needs, and that soft growth rots more easily on top of it. Bearded iris bloom best on a lean diet, a little low-nitrogen feed after flowering, if anything at all, and otherwise left to fend for themselves in decent soil. If you've been generous with the feed and stingy with the flowers, ease off the nitrogen. So you make one trip to the bed and you check three things: how deep the rhizome is sitting, how much sun is really reaching it now, and how crowded and how well fed it has quietly become. Depth is usually the culprit, but the walk that covers all three is the walk that solves it. Reading a plant of its leaves and its setting like that pays off right across a border, not just with iris. And I have gathered the diagnoses I reach for most into a small illustrated book. You can see the book cover and the web address on your screen. One diagnosis covered here. The Flower Gardener's Bible has all 14, and the full month-by-month calendar for your zone, $9 at bloomrayleigh.co. Once you have learned to read depth on an iris, you start seeing the same trap all over the border. And the clearest example is the peony. A peony is the other classic plant that will give you a decade of lush green foliage and almost no flowers, and the reason is identical. It is planted too deep. A peony grows from a fleshy root crowned with little pink growth buds, the eyes, and those eyes want to sit no more than an inch or two below the surface. Bury them deeper than that, the way you might reasonably bury any other perennial root, and the peony does just what the iris does. It throws up a handsome leafy bush every spring, healthy and green and completely flowerless, one season after another, while the gardener stands there wondering what is wrong with the variety. Nothing is wrong with that plant. The eyes are simply too deep, just like the rhizome. Lift the crown so the eyes sit barely under the soil and the flowers come back. Learn to distrust a leafy, flowerless perennial and to check its planting depth before anything else, and you have learned something you will lean on across the whole garden for the rest of your gardening life. Iris, peony, and a fair few others besides, all telling you the same thing in the same language. Too deep to bloom. So here is the whole thing in one breath. A big, leafy fan of iris with no flowers standing over it is almost never a sick plant, a tired plant, or a bad variety. It is a plant asking to be lifted an inch. The rhizome has sunk or been buried under settled soil and well-meant mulch. And a buried rhizome cannot bloom, not because it has been robbed of its sunbathing, but because it is drowning and going rotten down there in the warm, wet dark. Ignore the folklore about the sun baking buds into its back. Trust the plainer truth. Keep the crown sitting in daylight where it can breathe, raise the ones that have gone under, check the sun and the crowding while you are down there, and go easy on the feed. And do it this August, in the heat, while the plant is resting. July through September is your window to lift, divide, and reset bearded iris, so you have got the time. Get your hands into the fans this month, find that rhizome, bring it back up into the light, and you have given the plant a whole autumn to build the buds that open for you next May. The very fans you were ready to dig out and replace will come up carrying colour instead. If you want to keep bringing tired borders back into bloom instead of digging them out and starting over, then subscribe, and this channel will hand you one honest fix like this every week.